it is Diana here with Emergency Drinks, and today I'm really excited. I have an incredible guest. I've been stalking her since October when the genocide first started, and she has really provided me so much insight and really pushed me to kind of see who I am. And I've learned a lot about myself from her work in speaking up. Katie Bogen! Thank you so much for being here. It is such an honor to have you. Like I'm constantly so happy that the people I'm reaching out to be on my podcast are saying yes. Like I'm always like, oh my God, really? Thank you.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I really am excited to be here. I'm excited to chat with you. And I feel like you're one of those people who I interface with online. And every time I get a notification with your name on it, I'm like, I know this is going to be something kind. Like, I just know it's going to be lovely. So I'm really excited to chat with you.
Oh, well, I kind of feel like in a world where you could be like anything, like be kind. Because right now I feel like, man, people are just being really mean.
Yeah, it's
And
rough out there.
it's, I feel like that's an understatement. So, Katie, I think I don't know even where to start in a conversation with you because, like, I first saw you on, I'm pretty sure it was TikTok when you were like, "Hey, I'm Katie the Jew." I think that's what you used. That was your intro, right?
Yeah, Katie, the
And
American Jewish girl. Yep.
yes, I knew it was something Katie and Jewish, and yes. And so I think one of the first things I heard you talk about was being Jewish and your indoctrination into Zionism, which I guess, I mean, I'm a Jew as well. I've done the birthright, and we're going to get into all that. But for people that don't understand what this is, can you share a little bit about what indoctrination as it relates to Judaism is, please?
Oh, for sure. I mean, I think when I think about diaspora Jews, and I can really only speak to the perspective of Jewish Americans, like Jews being raised in the United States,
Mm-hmm.
there's this omnipresent mythology of the state of Israel that we are raised with. Like every Passover Seder, we say next year in Israel or next year in Jerusalem and sort of invoke our return to a homeland. We're raised thinking that there's this magical place in the Levant called Israel where we can all go one day to live in harmony, and indeed all should go. We should make aliyah, like this is where we're meant to be. And we invoke that constantly as we're growing up. And there's this sense of not only spiritual loyalty or like faith oriented loyalty to this land, but economic loyalty, where a lot of our synagogues give money to Israel, social loyalty, where you're supposed to hang out with other people who want to go to Israel. And it's this constant state of constructing a tie between American Jewry and sort of diaspora Jewry, though I have a lot of feelings about that word, and the state of Israel. And really, I think the biggest part of the indoctrination is what is not said. The biggest part of the indoctrination to me was the silence. I did not hear the word Palestine once until I was like 17 years old. I had no idea what Palestine was, like who Palestinians were as a people, what had been done to this community by Jews, like by Zionists. And that, I think, was a disgraceful silence, like a really heartbreaking silence. And I think there is this mythos too that's tied to the land of Israel that's very counterintuitive, where you'll hear two things growing up constantly of Israel is the only safe place for Jews, at the
Yes.
same time that you're hearing Jews in Israel are at risk all the time and must use whatever force necessary to defend themselves. And I think when you're indoctrinated into a community that presents you those cognitive conflicts and tells you resolve them on your own and doesn't explain any of the underlying logic or theory to why that is confusing, you learn to just tacitly or passively accept cognitive dissonance and confusion as part of being in that community. And when I started unlearning that is when my Zionism began to unravel.
That's very much the same. I did you go to Hebrew school?
I did not. I went to a Hasidic Chabad growing up, My parents got divorced when I was about 7, and my dad is a Polish Jew, and I wound up living with him and his parents. And the only synagogue in our very small town was this Hasidic Chabad. So I went from really not being involved in Jewish culture much as a small child to all of a sudden being in an ultra Orthodox environment, and stayed there until early high school and left. But the focus of the Chabad was really educating boys and men. And so I mostly went and listened um, to my rabbi and like heard the men studying and took care of kids.
Okay. So
Yeah.
I did Hebrew school from probably kindergarten up until 8th grade, and I dropped out, and then I ended up going back and getting bat mitzvahed, like through an unaffiliated. But when I was being raised, like my mom and I were trying to figure out like where I like learned everything, because when I at some point in my life, or when I was like 7 years old, I remember holding a little globe keychain in my hand and looking at it and thinking the world would be so much better if the Middle East just blew up, except for Israel. But and I don't know where that came from, but somewhere it was put into my head that the Middle East was bad and that it was filled with terrorists who wanted to kill me. And so my mom and I were going back through all of my Hebrew school books a couple of months ago when I was home, because we really had a lot of conversations about all this the past 9 months of the genocide. I couldn't find anything in the Hebrew school books. They mentioned Palestine as it becoming Israel and it being our land and belonging to us. And that's really the only mention of it. And I was thinking about this the other day in the Hebrew school I went to. Yeah, I learned about religion, I think, but mostly I learned about Israel. And so it's not Hebrew school in the sense like where you go to Bible study with these other religions. It's you're going to learn about Israel and your right to be in Israel and the Jews' right to be in Israel. And so to me that was really interesting, but not being able to figure out how I was indoctrinated, and I will never know where those ideas came from. I can only imagine it was through something in Hebrew school, because my parents would have never taught me that. But when you started first talking about unlearning Zionism, talk a little bit about Zionism, because I think it's everything we see online now is either people being very proud to be a Zionist or people really shaming people who are Zionists. And I think I met someone a couple months ago and he said he was a liberal Zionist.
Mm-hmm.
And my friend was like, that doesn't exist. That's not a thing. And I've like taken it upon myself these past 9 months to really read a lot. And I bought two books about Zionism, and one of them, the first chapter, is literally breaking down like the different layers of Zionism. So,
Yeah, I would tend to agree with your friend on impulse of liberal Zionism is kind of a misnomer, because
mhm,
the meat of Zionism is Zionism is Zionism. When I think about my Judaism, I think about my relationship with God,
mhm,
with my family, with Jewish tradition and culture external from geography, like Jewish
yeah,
tradition and culture that can exist anywhere, and my relationship with the self and sort of the mission of being a Jewish adult, what that means, what it means to contribute to sort of tikkun olam and the healing of the world. When I think about Zionism, that is an ethno nationalist political project that was initiated in the late 1800s by and early 1900s by Theodor Herzl and this group of Zionist leaders who wanted a mass immigration of Jews from around the world to the Levant, specifically to settle in the land of Israel and be as close to Jerusalem as possible. Not because they were Jewish in their faith, but because there was a culture of Ashkenazi Judaism that was facing marginalization in Eastern Europe, and they did want someplace safe to go, but they were also contending with this political colonization soup in the context of the race for Africa and the race to colonize Africa. So we had France and the US and the UK and many different countries trying to carve up the continent of Africa so that we could capitalize on the resources embedded in the land. And around that time, the UK had been attempting to colonize Palestine, and it really wasn't going all that well. And then you had multiple waves of aliyah, or waves of emigration of Jews to Israel, to historic Palestine, occupied Palestine, in the early 1900s prior to World War II. And I think the global chaos and the simultaneous hatred of and sympathy for Jews after World War II created the perfect storm to really embed Zionism into a nation state, which is after World War II, you had these 100,000 or more Jewish refugees that needed someplace to go, that were sort of scattered in these camps that were being liberated. And the United States did not want to take on 100,000 Jews because there was still cultural anti Semitism in the West. And neither did France, and neither did the UK. But what these nations all had in common was, and really it was the United States and Britain, what they really had in common was a desire to colonize Africa and Northern Africa and to move up into the Levant. And how convenient to have this group of 100,000 traumatized refugees to settle rich land that hadn't yet been mined or raped for resources, and to build this military partnership where all of a sudden we could have an outpost for Western military interests in the Middle East, and something that could have tendrils into the Arab world. And I really think this decision on the part of the US and the UK to support the founding of Israel was a politically expedient choice to try to manipulate that region and mine it for resources for the decades and generations to come. And that's really what we've seen. So when I think about my Judaism, I think about all of the lessons I did learn in Chabad about values and ethics, and the lessons I took from my grandfather about resilience, and my family about what we can survive, and sort of efforts to exterminate Jewish culture. And I think about a relationship with God and who I am as a person. When I think about Zionism, I think about that process of land takeover and violent colonization and the Nakba that has created an ethno-nationalist state that's founded in the violent oppression of an indigenous people. And I can dissect those things and bifurcate those things much more easily now than I could a decade ago when I started parsing the difference for me.
Yeah, I think part of it, because I did Birthright way long in like 2001, pre 9/11. I did Birthright. So it was when I believe it was, I think it was Hamas or Fatah had started the suicide bombings. It was right after the Intifada. And so that's when they were doing the bus bombings. And so we were very much in this like hyper alert state. I was probably 21 or 22, and we had our rabbi, and then we had two IDF soldiers. Some of the days we were in a bulletproof bus. Some of the days the rabbi had an M16 strapped on him as we sat around in like the Masada or something, singing songs and learning how every Arab person wanted to kill us.
Mm-hmm.
Not once was there a conversation about Palestinians being oppressed. Not once was there a conversation about sealing off the strip and limiting anything. All I experienced that first trip was fear, was ethno-pride. Ethno-pride, is that a word? But like pride in Israel, wanting to make Aliyah, and feeling such a connection to the land. Because I think I was going through my journal with my mom a couple months ago, and we were trying like to figure out where I learned like the indoctrination actually, and where all of a sudden I was thinking that Israel or Jews have always been oppressed and everyone wants to kill us and we are not safe anywhere but Israel, but also we are only safe in Israel. Those big things that you learn. And it was in Birthright, because every single thing I wrote was about the history of Jews and how much people, or how everyone wanted to kill us, and the connection I felt to the land and how important it was as a Jew to have this land. And I conflated that with the culture and the heritage of Judaism. And I've been back to Israel several times since then. And it was only one of the last times in 2014 when, at that point, I was almost vegan. I was vegetarian. I had been working in animal rights and living in Thailand, and I went on a trip and started basically in Israel. And I met a few of my friends. And at the time, I was a travel blogger, and I was working with a tour operator. And they had a tour of Hebron where it was Hebron A and B. And so it was led by a Jewish person in the Israeli side of Hebron in the West Bank, and then a Palestinian in the West Bank. And the day before, we had rented a car and decided to go to Bethlehem. And that was the first time I saw the wall. Just seeing that wall, and my friend, he was Israeli, and he told me, he's like, you can't go to Bethlehem, Diana. It's so dangerous. You can't tell them you're Jewish if you go. They're going to kill you. You just lie to them. I really don't think you should go. And my other friends and I went. We were just like, absolutely not. We're going to go. I'm not scared of this. I understand that this is how you were raised, but I wasn't raised like this. And my friends have been to Palestine numerous times. I'm going. And we went to Bethlehem, and everyone was so warm and welcoming. But that wall was the most terrifying thing I've seen. And the checkpoints to get through, and how we as white folk that had American or Canadian passports could just go through was astounding to me. And then the next day in Hebron, listening to, there was I don't know if he was a rabbi, but very Hasidic Jew, and he was talking to us about the land. And I said, well, what if your kids are run into a little Palestinian child? Would you play with them? And he looked at me and said, absolutely not, never. And I think it was in that moment when I realized that these generations, every generation has been raised to hate. And I couldn't see a solution from that. And we went over to the Palestinian side, and hearing the stories of these Palestinians, of the settlers, and how they have the netting over the souks, the main markets in Hebron, and because the settlers were throwing trash on them. Yeah. And then just the stories I heard. And then as we were leaving, some kids started throwing rocks at the IDF. And so the IDF started setting off sound grenades. And that was their life. And just seeing that and being exposed to it for the first time was shocking to me. That the contradiction, the juxtaposition between these settlers and their life of freedom, and right down the hill are these barricades and no man's land and IDF soldiers with guns constantly threatening these people. And that's just the West Bank. I knew, like, at that point, I had talked about was interested in Gaza, and my friend was like, you absolutely can't, like, Gaza is the most dangerous place on earth for a Jew. You can't go. And so I never went. That was the first time I saw and realized that as an American Jew, there was so much being left out of the conversation, and so much we weren't being told. And then last summer, I worked with an Israeli company. Needless to say, they don't speak to me anymore. There's the misinformation that they're told, the stories they're told as Israelis, is shocking to me as well. You've been to Israel, yes?
Yeah, I went on Birthright as well. Yep.
And was your experience similar to mine?
My experience was brainwash central, but I knew it would be. I've told this story a few times, so if people have heard me on other pods, it might sound familiar. But I had a dear loved one come back from Birthright after my first year of college, and I had just started taking courses on sort of Middle East politics, Arab-Israeli conflict, like the way that they can label courses in the United States. And I knew enough to ask this person when they returned, what did you learn about Palestine? And this person who I had never heard use racially and ethnically charged language like this said, oh, you mean the terrorists? And I was like, whoa. We had grown up in sort of post 9/11 Connecticut. We had family in New York. And so this idea of seeing anti-Muslim and like Islamophobic, though don't really love that word either, anti-Muslim sentiment and rejecting it. Like my family was sort of a good progressive family. When we saw anti-Muslim sentiment, we tried really hard to unlearn and deconstruct that stuff. And so to hear someone that I loved call an entire group of brown-coated people terrorists, I was like, boop, haven't we been taught exactly not to do that? Like that was baffling to me. So I really dove into coursework on Judaism and on Palestine before I went to Israel because I wanted to be cognitively prepared and like buffered against some of the propaganda that I know my friends and community were experiencing at the time. And so by the time I went on this trip, I had taken 4 official courses on the region. And then I was in the political science department at my institution. It's affiliated with the Holocaust and Genocide Studies department. So I had taken Jewish experience, suffering and evil in the Jewish tradition, Middle East politics, and Arab-Israeli conflict, college level courses, and then courses in this Holocaust and Genocide Studies department. And I was also an English minor, so I was taking things like fictions of empire and learning sort of through literature about legacies of colonization. And I went on this Birthright trip ready to fight. I was so fired up about everything that had been hidden from me. I had just taken a semester-long course that mapped out the chronology of the Nakba for me for the first time. And I remember reading about the Nakba and having all of these discussions in class of how do people not know this? And so I went on Birthright and had a tour guide named Ayal, who was a veteran from the Second Lebanon War, and used this as a badge of authenticity, of saying, like, I have real lived experience in the context of this conflict, and thus what I tell you will be unbiased. He claimed like objectivity because of his experience. And I was like, no. The fact that you have been in this context of trauma actually is more likely to bias you. And he would bring up Palestinians and never actually say Palestine. He would say Hamas or the terrorists. And so I would actually ask him in front of these other students on the trip, can you make the distinction between Palestine and terrorists? And he would refuse. And I would say, okay, what about the water crisis? Can you talk about why the West Bank is still being settled? Why is the Strip locked off? You have this incredible desalination technology in Israel and this ability to farm in the desert and to really make land habitable in the desert, and you're not sharing this technology with people who are facing a water crisis. There's a food crisis. Can you talk to us about indefinite detention? Like, how does the justice system work here for Palestinians? And I was trying to ask the sort of core questions I had learned in my courses that Israeli propaganda neglects.
Yeah.
And all I was getting back from this tour guide was the terrorists, the terrorists, the terrorists, the terrorists. And I remember they took us right across the border from Syria. We were in like the Golan Heights area, and we were listening. It was 2014 as well. And it was in the middle of Israeli aggression toward Syria and this bombardment of Gaza. And I could hear the bombs dropping in Syria. And our tour guides were telling us, you hear that sound? That's what we're protecting you from. And I had this like dissonance moment of like, whoa. Aren't those Israeli bombs? Like, what do you mean you're protecting us from this? These are Israeli weapons being used against a different population across the border. Like, there's no relevancy to that. And I found it really confusing that they could bring impressionable 18 to 26-year-old kids to the border of a conflict, make them listen to the sounds of violence that is being perpetrated by Zionism, and say, we're protecting you from this. It's so many tendrils of a spider web to have to weave to really indoctrinate folks. And I did wind up being bat mitzvahed on that trip. I was bat mitzvahed in Jerusalem. It was beautiful. And I think on that trip, I really committed myself to 2 things: being a Jewish adult and anti-Zionism. Like, I had seen enough. And that was 10 or 11 years ago now.
You know, I'm so sad that it took me until 2014 to know anything, because honestly, up until October, I really trusted the news I was told. I trusted what I was being reported to me, because why? My background's journalism. And so I've always been taught, you know, journalists are fighting for the truth. You are to share this. So when I really started watching the genocide unfold on TikTok, seeing everything, I was just like, how is the news media saying this? And so that was really the start of my like unlearning, and you talking about your indoctrination, and me going back and looking at all these things and thinking, my gosh, like, this is this is what I was taught, and I never thought to question it, because why would any of these people lie? Why would any of this be misconstrued? I couldn't imagine seeing everything now. I think I think to my friends who are Israeli, who obviously are no longer my friends, but the the betrayal that they must feel to realize, if they're even able to realize, the amount of propaganda they've been fed, the amount of lies they've been told, the reality, if they've taken the time to really learn any of it, it just must be this devastating thing. And so that is like the one part of me that I look at people who are Zionists and think, I can't imagine the gymnastics you're playing in your head to make this all make sense,
Yeah.
and how terrible it must feel for you to even think that like everything that you've been told was not accurate, and that you've actually been a part of this oppression and this apartheid and genocide. And it makes me really sad, and it devastates me that I've lost people that I care about. But I also feel that we don't have anything in common. If,
Yeah.
like, at our core, if you can see and justify the killing of 100, 200,000 people in the name of Judaism, I can't do that. I can't be a part of it. It's just not something that's okay with me. And yes, I feel like you always have to have this caveat. I don't support what happened October 7th, but also I understand why it happened. And I made it my goal. The only thing I read now is literature and history books about Palestine and about Israel and the history. I can tell you the history of genocide in the US because I read a like 5 million page book about it over the winter. Like, it's all I'm reading because I want to know so I can speak on it. Because originally when all of this happened, I didn't want to speak on it because I thought it was nuanced. It was this, it was that. It was all the reasons that people say they don't want to speak out. They don't want to get involved. And I decided that I want to speak out on this because as a Jewish person who was indoctrinated, I feel it's my duty to speak up for Palestinians, to say, hey, this is what's going on. This is a genocide. These people aren't terrorists. This is not the truth of their existence, but this is what we were raised to believe, and I'm sorry. And I hope someone's listening to me that maybe is open to learning. And I know you've been so involved and so active in it. Your history. I know that you had said that you had had a pretty decent TikTok following prior to all of this, but then your Instagram has blown up. And what's that been like for you?
Bizarre. It's really weird. People absolutely treat me differently, but I also think in my actual life, I think about so many things, and
Yeah,
Palestine and the genocide occupy probably a solid like 40% of my everyday cognitive functioning. Like, I'm thinking about Palestine 40% of the
yeah,
time. But there are things that fill the other 60%. If you look at my social media, Palestine is 95% of my feed, and I relegate the rest of my life to 5%. And I really do try to prioritize what I share, which means people don't get to know sort of other folks' richness of the self
yeah,
online. And I think there's something to be said for prioritization of really what is important, which is talking about this ongoing genocide, educating people, helping them to understand that we actually have really sophisticated ethical and moral impulses in our bodies. We have a biological imperative to maintain humanity as a species. And when we see violence being done, mass violence, things that we almost cannot comprehend because they're so evil, we have an instinctive response to that. And so if your body is telling you, I don't actually think this is all that complicated, I think we're just seeing human horror and human evil, you can trust that impulse. Like, we don't have to buy into this, I think, mythology that it's all that complicated, because it's not. When you witness collective punishment and a military that is armed to the teeth, bombing families who have not done anything in their homes, that doesn't have to be complicated. That can just be something that makes you horrified. Um, And so I think part of it has been wanting to really interrogate how complicated it is and present things in as simple terms as possible for folks. I think, on the other hand, growing a social media following as rapidly as I have comes with some complications. I want to share my authentic self with people. I want to be able to engage in dialectics, which is holding seemingly contradictory things at the same time. Yes, I am an advocate for Palestine. Yes, I'm an anti-Zionist Jew. I will target my sort of re-education content on toward Jewish people who are in the process of unlearning Zionism. I think that's what I can contribute. And on the other hand, I'm a sex researcher. I'm a human sexuality scholar. I'm a trainee trauma therapist. I'm a fourth year doctoral student in psychology. My research is pleasure oriented. If you read my recent academic publications, I talk about queer women's sexual functioning. I'm a queer person myself. I've written papers recently on things like stealthing or non consensual condom removal, trauma survivors' access to pleasure and desire, masturbation, how people engage with their intimate partners after sexual assault. Like, that's what I study. And when I first started talking about that aspect of my work online, it was, I think, misconstrued in a deeply socially violent way. I had been on this panel with a bunch of other Jewish activists called All I Want for Hanukkah is a Free Palestine. And we had spoken on this panel about ways to maintain solidarity and motivation to stay in fights for justice. And I talked about the importance of embodiment and said, at the very beginning of COVID-19, because of all of my research on sort of sexuality and the healing power of the body, I began a daily orgasm practice years ago, like 2020, to try to get myself rooted in pleasure, not for pleasure's sake itself, but because when we experience chronic exposure to traumatizing content, we disassociate and we create a pattern of leaving our bodies over and over and over again. When you are numbed out and disassociated and blunting against this onslaught of information, you lose the wisdom of your body, the sensations that tell you what emotion you're feeling, that discomfort in your gut that says, I think I'm really sad, or that pain in your heart that says, I'm witnessing an injustice. And so a way to get back into the body so that you can feel and process those emotions is tactile, is sensory play. And it doesn't have to be orgasms. And I said this as well on that episode or that event. I said, it doesn't have to be orgasms. You can brush your hair, you could take a bath, you can put on hand lotion, you can sit and do deep breathing, you could do yoga, you can kneel and pray if the movement of being in prayer helps you get back into your body so that you can connect to the sensations that grant you the wisdom to identify your emotions, great. And that episode came out and was immediately twisted, as the internet does, to this white Jewish girl is getting off to genocide and getting off to Palestinian death. And that was my first
Ugh.
sort of onslaught of, oh, there's one side of being on the internet and educating and hopefully contributing to justice work, which feels very impactful. And there's this other side to being on the internet, which is that people are going to interpret you in the way that they want. People are going to see you in the light that they already have, make enormous assumptions and really misconstrue what you say. And you have to be able to stomach that in order to stay in this, in order to continue doing the work. And that's something I still think about all the time of, I felt like I was granting this, not even advice, but this piece of wisdom garnered from my work as a trainee psychologist, my PhD level studies, my academic scholarship, which I'm 30 years old and I've been working in sexual functioning and violence prevention work since I graduated in 2015. I have almost a decade in this field. And it was taken as this white Jewish woman is getting off to Palestinian death. And that, I think, is one of the shocks of garnering a following, is you really have no idea, once the information that you share is out there, how it will be interpreted, misinterpreted, reinterpreted, and disseminated to others. There was like a US state senator who wound up tweeting a video of me saying I was like getting off to genocide. And I was like, whoa. So it really, it's been a learning process. And I think there are times I do have to step away and remind myself who I am, why I'm in this, how to be effective, and then return once I'm not like in my own defensiveness or hurt feelings.
It's really hard. I had an experience in 2017 where I was sexually assaulted in another country, and I filed a police report and I wrote about it because at that time, I was a travel blogger, and the vitriol and the hate that I got, the articles written about me. And at that point, it was before I had launched, or I had my vegan account, but I kept them separate. And so this was just on my personal page. These people started coming after me. These articles about me were saying that I made up a sexual assault to get famous. And I was like, no woman does that. Like, that is not a thing. It's something a man would say, or it's something like a white conservative woman that probably voted for Trump would say. Like, it's not, it boggled my mind that like I had all of these people after me, and that something like that was misconstrued so deeply. And since then I've kind of been like, because obviously it was really hard to go through something like that. And I had EMDR and I had a lot of therapy to get past it. And now it's when I started speaking out about genocide and the hate comments and the nastiness started rolling in, I'm sitting there and I'm thinking, you know, I've had so much worse said to me. Like, if I can get through like people trying to cancel me over this in 2017, like I can handle this bullshit that Zionists are saying to me. But it's been astounding to me the language people use to speak to me.
Yep.
And the things they say, and that it's coming from inside the house. Like it's coming from other Jewish people. And that to me is the most disappointing, disheartening, sad thing, is that people that I've always felt such a kinship with, that we were raised to kind of believe that like as Jews, like we are the same, we are brothers, we are sisters, we are all family. And just to have these people and family itself suddenly look at me as like the bad guy and say these things to me is just, it's a terrible thing. And what kind of response have you gotten from the Jewish community? Because you have, obviously you're a lot more out there in terms of following and stuff like that than I am. And I can't imagine
I
what
get,
you get.
yeah, I get a lot of capo. I get a lot
Oh,
of
yeah.
your grandfather would be ashamed of you, your family should be ashamed of you, you're a
Yeah.
traitor, you're disgusting, you're a fake Jew, bad Jew, etc. I think the psychology of Zionism is is an indoctrination of violence and a normalization of violence and a projection of desired violence onto other people. It's sort of like when I was in Israel and they were like, "Oh, you hear those bombs dropping? That's what we're protecting you from." I get that psychology weaponized against me all the time. So I'll talk about being queer or being a sex positive woman who does sex research, and then I'll talk about Palestine. And Zionists will hop on my page and say things like Hamas would throw you off a building or Palestinians would rape and kill you. And I'm like, let's deconstruct what just happened. What just happened here is you saw a queer person or you saw a sex positive woman, you got angry that that queer person or that sex positive woman didn't align with your politics, and you had a fantasy of that person, that woman, being punished and violated and brutalized by someone you imagine as violent. That all happened internally. That all happened in your own head. You saw someone you disagreed with, you got upset, you fantasized about them being harmed, and then you told them about your fantasy. That has nothing to do with Hamas, actually. That has nothing to do with Palestinians. That has nothing to do with the Nakba and 76-year drip genocide. That has to do with a psychology of violence and a wish to harm people that you perceive as the enemy. And I see these comments all the time, and I'm like, please take responsibility for your own imagination. Like, if you're fetishizing the idea of me being raped and murdered, that's happening in your own head, buddy. And like, maybe talk to a therapist, maybe figure out why when you see people who disagree with you, you want them to be harmed so badly by someone you can label as a proxy, like that seems to me like such a sickness, like really ill and unwell stuff. And so that's been something that's really striking to me. And the fact that while they're saying this out loud, they're trying to place culpability for that harm on a group that isn't even involved in the dynamic, like is not present for that dyadic interaction. So I'm like, you're invoking someone that right now in this interactional space doesn't exist, is a construct or is in your head. And so I think I'm really grateful for my training as a therapist. I'm really grateful that I'm being trained as a psychologist, because being able to witness these like maladaptive thinking patterns and being able to engage in like a healthy distancing metacognition is accessible for me. And I have needed that. But when I meet people who do not have my training or background and who can't see, hey, buddy, all of that just happened in your head, and then you chose to say it out loud to be violent, they don't necessarily have the skills to either acknowledge that that's what's happening and or then address how not to do it again. And
Yeah.
that is very sad to me.
How can people unlearn? What is something that we can do to facilitate that?
I think they have to be allowed to feel the pain of unlearning.
Yeah.
Unlearning the promise and glittering mythology of Israel for Jews and for Zionists who are in their process is a grieving process. It sucks. It hurts. I remember in 2013, 14, when I was taking all these courses, being so angry. And underneath that anger, beneath that sense of betrayal, is a deep sadness of like, you promised me something. My elders promised me something. My community promised me something. We built a fairy tale together that was so compelling, that offered me safety and a sense of being seen and authenticity in my Judaism. And these things were beautiful. And now I found out that the foundation of that promise was a blood price of hundreds of thousands of people, at this point, millions of displaced and brutalized people. Sparks a fury. And it is uncomfortable to sit in that pain, and it is uncomfortable to sit in that rage. And when people feel strong, challenging emotions, they buffer and they numb and they separate and they put up that dividing wall and just say, I'm not going to deal with this so I can continue living over here in the fantasy. And if we give people the skills to actually feel their feelings, to get in the body and allow their emotions to happen, they will be able to move through the process of grieving and come to a point of higher cognition. Like when you are in a trauma place and a sadness place, you're not thinking with empathy and compassion for the person who's been constructed as your enemy. You're thinking from a place of pain and survival instinct. You are in your lizard brain. That's not where we come to a peace process, and that's not where we learn to perspective take. And so I think I hear a lot of people saying, don't center the experiences of Jews right now, don't center the voices or feelings of Zionists. And I think for those people, if that is their boundary, great. You maintain that boundary. I think that makes perfect sense, particularly for Palestinians, particularly for people who are bearing witness to the suffering of their communities. I, because I was born an American Jew, am buffered from that harm and that hurt right now. And I do have the emotional latitude to hold Zionists' pain and say, if you're in the process of unlearning, I hear you. It sucks. Like, it is emotionally brutal to have that promise torn away from you and to have to see the cost in human lives and in absolute horrific violence, the cost of that fantasy. So if people need a processing zone for, I am just starting to unlearn this, and I'm sad and I'm hurt and I'm angry, and they don't want someone to say, well, fuck your feelings, come talk to me. That's the space that I'm trying to build.
I love that. That's truly beautiful. We're running out of time, but I do want to bring up joy.
Yes. Yeah, that's something that I was super excited to chat about today. So I really appreciate the wisdom of Adrienne Marie Brown, who wrote the book Pleasure Activism, and I think just came out with another book, We Will Not Cancel Us. And And they are an incredible educator on the political utility of pleasure, and sort of how accessing pleasure as a resource, as a healing and grounding resource, facilitates wisdom of the self, like knowing yourself and being able to identify your emotions because you're not alienated from the body, and then behaving in a values aligned way, building community, contributing to liberation. And how if we burn out, if we tell other activists that in order to be the perfect activist, you must be miserable all the time because that is the benchmark of your solidarity, then all we're going to do is amputate the possibility of this movement. And I'm not trying to be insensitive with the use of the term amputate, because I think spiritually or emotionally, that's what we're doing. We are removing a movement potential, which is devastating. And again, to use, I think, very intentional terminology, disabling of a community that should be able to prop each other up when we are wounded and when we are harmed and when something is really challenging. Like, part of pleasure activism is also disability justice. Part of the movement for Palestinian solidarity is also disability justice. Disability justice means acknowledging that being in movements for social good can be incredibly painful and challenging for different people based on their capacities. If someone experiences post-traumatic stress, if they have a chronic illness, if they have some other disease or challenge that is taking up space in their life, and they are being told by fellow activists that they must be miserable all the time,
You're not doing enough.
it is a multiplicative burden. And so if instead we tell each other, you get to rest and you get to heal and you get to experience joy and you get to be part of this movement in a way that works for you, like, find your growth curve, certainly find your growth edge and exist in it. But I'm not going to tell you that in order to be the perfect activist, you have to be miserable all the time. And I'm not going to tell you that 40% of your consciousness being focused on Palestine is not enough and it should be 100%. Like, perhaps you need that 60% elsewhere so that the 40% time can be effective. So I would say I've been learning more and more from Adrienne Marie Brown to focus on Palestine in the context of pleasure activism and liberation and experiencing joy in the body. I've really been trying to glean wisdom from disability activists as well, of how do we approach the, not even limitations, but what other people can and can't do, what they are not able to do at any given time, with an appreciation that they're trying and an acknowledgement that that's their reality and it's not actually our responsibility or role to change any of that, and to just arrive at a movement with the skills that we have and apply them to the best of our knowledge. And so those are really the pieces that I think are contributing to my efficacy and joy.
I think it's really important because compassion fatigue coming from the animal rights side of things is a real thing. And it's really hard when you are constantly like being told what you're doing isn't good enough. And, well, you're not this or you're not that enough in order to be a part of this. And so I think that's something really important that activists and people who are speaking out against the genocide and in support of Palestine just keep in mind, because we're 9 months into this and every day I feel like it gets worse, and it's a hard thing for the world to witness and to feel that. I mean, I know I feel powerless a lot of the time, and so I do what I can to not feel like that. And you've done such an incredible job, Katie. I could literally talk to you for hours about all of this. So I want to be respectful of your time, but I might want to have you on again to talk about this. You're amazing. I really appreciate you. I'm going to, in our show notes, I'm going to put all the information about how people can follow you. The last question, what are you drinking? Because I forgot to ask you that at the beginning.
I have two different things. I have like a soba tea, which is a sort of like savory tea with some jasmine. Ooh. And I have a French roast coffee with almond creamer.
I love it. I'm just drinking water today. I was feeling very basic. I had jalapeno. I had passion fruit jalapeno margaritas last night. So they were very good. Very good. So I was like, but I would like water for my morning today. thank you. And thank you all for tuning in to Emergency Drinks. And be sure to like, follow, subscribe, all those things that I think I'm supposed to ask you to do at the end.
Perfect. It was so lovely